even though I know everyone here, I guess for the tape I'll introduce myself. I'm Mike Rotkin. I've been activist in union work all my adult life. I worked in the UAW plant in Baltimore back in the 60s when I was still 17 years old, 18 years old, and then got a regular job when I got older. In Santa Cruz, was active in helping create the University Council of the American Federation of Teachers, which represents the lecturers and librarians in the UC system statewide. And I served in that organization as chief negotiator for the lecturers for about 20 years and chief negotiator for the librarians for 5 years. I was also the local president here at Santa Cruz for about 20 plus years, and vice president of everything at one time or another in the statewide organization, vice president for grievances, for legislation, and then most of my time at the end, vice president for organizing. I've been active in the Central Labor Council, so I've had a pretty strong experience here in the labor movement in Santa Cruz over the years. I was on the executive committee for 10 years of the Santa Cruz County Central Labor Council, which is now the Monterey Bay Central Labor Council, by combining two counties. I also have taught in the program Community Studies, from which I retired, although I've been recalled to do some field study work here at Merrill College at UCSC. And my teaching was about community organizing, labor issues, broad spectrum of social change issues, and as well as teaching a Marxism class and other things related to mobilizing people in society. So my talk is based a lot on that experience of both teaching and the practical work in the labor movement. And our topic today is the question of social movement unionism, or the connection between social movements and unions, and how do we understand that relationship, what has it been, what could it be, how important is that connection, and so forth. And first thing I want to say is it's not a new topic to ask what's the relationship between unions and social movements. I'm going to start with a quote from Rosa Luxemburg from 1904. She writes, so it's a somewhat abstruse quote, but I'll try and read it in a way that's followable. It says, "For the first time in history, the masses of the people themselves, against all ruling classes, are expressing their will. But this will can only be realized, that's to say made real, outside of and beyond the present society. On the other hand, this will can only develop in the daily struggle with the established order, thus only within the framework of the existing order. The unification of the great mass of the people with a goal that goes beyond the whole established order, of the daily struggle with the revolutionary overthrow, this is the dialectical contradiction of the social democratic movement, which must develop consistently between two obstacles: the loss of its mass character and the abandonment of its goal and becoming a sect, becoming a sect and becoming a bourgeois reformist movement." And the German social democratic movement from about 1885 up until its collapse around the time of World War I really conceived of social changes involving two kinds of processes: defensive activities, defending what people have, dealing with their day-to-day needs, and a perspective that we needed to create a different kind of society, to change the rules of how capitalism and how it works and replace it with a socialist alternative society. And they saw the unions as playing a defensive role, and the political party, is playing a more offensive role, in which pushing the vision of a future alternative way to organize things. And that's the division that they saw this in. And this was true throughout the Second International movement, not just in Germany, in France and Italy, throughout Europe, even in the United States in some ways. And this whole idea that unions exist to defend the daily needs of their members, to fight for a bigger piece of the existing pie within the logic of the existing system. And if you wanted to really change that system, that was going to be something outside of unionism. That was going to take place really in a different struggle. It would be organized by a political party and by social movements around those issues and so forth. Our problem is we don't have a socialist party. We don't have a big set of a big social movement, or a set of even small social movements of any significance in the United States that take on that kind of a struggle. And so the unions, I think, in some very real way, have been thrust into the position of having to not only carry on the defensive work of making sure that people don't get abused, given workloads that are impossible to carry out, underpaid, separated out from the decision making about how their jobs work and the sort of democratic decisions in the workplace and those kinds of questions. We have to play the role of trying to suggest to people that there's possibility of a different kind of a world. And as it turns out, from my practical experience working in the labor movement, you really can't just do defensive work alone. It's hard to get people very excited about the idea of defending what they have now when what they have now is not that great. I mean, it's certainly, I believe our union has created probably, at least arguably, the best contract for contingent faculty, for non-tenure track faculty in the United States. We have some real security for people after 6 years. There's very few contingent faculty that have that kind of protection. We've got some protections. They're not great, but against churning people in the early years, at least the rules against just getting rid of people totally capriciously, although a lot of that goes on. We have reasonably good pay. We've dramatically increased the pay. When I started teaching here, the full-time pay was $18,000 a year. Now it's $50,000 a year for the same job that I would have taken then. And it's still going up and changing, a bunch of other positive things. But it's the times that we've been able to mobilize our members have been when we had something exciting to do that was going to really expand what the power that people would have over their jobs, the satisfaction they would find in the work that they were doing, not just in defending the existing contractual arrangements or stopping the management from paying people less or laying them off or abusing them in a variety of ways. And so unions, I think today that's true generally. Unions in the United States have been thrust into the situation where if all they do is defend the existing contracts, that, first of all, aside from the fact that even the unions themselves only represent 12 or 13% of the working people in the United States, it's hard to get even those people active and mobilized and doing something if all you're doing is committing that you're going to stop abuses of the existing contract or marginally improve the contract in a bargaining situation. What really excites members and what gets them active and gets them involved in stopping even the attacks on the members is trying to figure out the projection of a possibility that's exciting about how a union really could make life at work different than it is right now. As a consequence, in our union, we've made a turn. We were very successful at doing just general bargaining work and our grievance activities, defending the existing contract. That's mainly what we've been doing for most of the history of our union since we won our first contract, marginally increasing the contract. Between 1999 and 2003, we created what we called the Contract for a New Century. We could have called it the Contract for a New Millennium, but we were being modest, But the Contract for a New Century, in which we decided that the existing arrangements that we had in our contract, which gave you 3-year contracts after your 6th year, was not really good enough. What we needed to have was an open-ended contract that you basically could keep your job as long as the work was still there. And as long as your classes were being taught, what they could not do was take away your classes and give them to a new lecturer, or divide one job into 2 and give them to 2 different new people that would be cheaper, or the fact that you've gotten a pay increase would make you more expensive, so let's hire somebody new out of grad school to take over your job. So that our contract, we fought to have a open-ended, continuing appointment for people who are contingent faculty here after 6 years. We managed to excite our members. We created real activism in that period, 1999 to 2003. We worked with allies in the community. We went to the legislature. We brought members of the legislature to our bargaining table to let them see how UC was treating us at the bargaining table. It was a beautiful moment when I had the head of the Assembly Labor Committee sitting next to me at the bargaining table and the new negotiator for the university on the other side. We were trying to talk about trying to get some, even then, marginal improvements in the first 6 years so people at least have a right to get the review for this post-6-year appointment. And the guy across the table said, look, the first 6 years, people are at will. They're at will like McDonald's. Don't you get it? It's like McDonald's. They're at will. And it was so perfect to have this guy from the labor committee sitting next to me. So that's how they want to treat the people doing half of the teaching in the UC system, like people that are frying the fries at McDonald's. Not that that's not also work that somebody has to do and should be well treated for, but the idea that you have higher education workers who are going to be treated like, well, we'll pay whatever we have to, the minimum to get away with, not going to be successful. And what we found is that what excited people in that bargaining effort then, and what we made this turn again, we've realized during the period since 2003, we've fallen back in this pattern of nibbling away at minor problems in our contracts, trying to keep people active, getting them involved, but it's very, very difficult to do so. But what we found is if you can project an image of a very different kind of work life, and that is achievable, and it's possible to actually win that, and that's something that should be achieved by not just people that work in universities, but people in every job. So that if you do the teaching at the university, you should be involved in setting the curriculum. You should have something to say about the way the courses work and what's actually involved in the different classes, not just be given a teaching job, an assignment, teach this course, here's your text, which happens at some universities. Here's your textbook, teach this class, here's the test that we want you to give, here's the expectations for what they'll know at the end of the class for the next class that comes along. You've got to project an image where people will be involved in their departments, not as second-class citizens, but as active members deciding what's going to be taught in this program. You do half the teaching, you should have something to say about what's being taught and how it's being taught. People should be involved in the extracurricular life of the campus, be citizens of the campus where they teach, not just hired guns that teach on 3 separate campuses and never have times to connect. So I really think that at this point, if unions are going to be successful in rebuilding a labor movement in this country, and it has to be rebuilt, we're in really sad shape right now, it's going to be because we are able to project a kind of a social activism, a possibility of a very different world than just holding on to the important but small gains that we've won. Those are important, you've got to defend them, but you can't even defend those if you don't project an image that involves us working with the parents of the students that go to UC and fighting about tuition issues. It's not just about the pay for our members. It's not just about their workload. It's about how do you keep this a public university? How do you keep the academic freedom that exists in this institution? How can this be a place that the young people of California can get an education that they need to be able to work and have meaningful work in their futures? And that's a very much bigger image of what a future should be about than the holding on to the defensive, like, my gosh, we're under attack. We haven't got time to project a future. If you don't project a more positive future, different set of arrangements, a full democratic vision of the way a university should function, the way every job should function, you're not going to be able to mobilize your members, and if you can't mobilize your members, you're not even going to be able to hold on to the small gains that you've been able to win in the past. So I think that the social movement, unionism, is a critical kind of function for us in the current period, where we're going to lose what little hold we have on the working class at all right now. And that's my view of it in general, where we need to go.
Cool.
I guess so.
I'm so glad you went first. Set of the context for us. So I don't know all of you, but I know a lot of you. My name's Allison Cavara, and Daniel invited me to be part of this panel a few days ago, so I'm kind of just putting my thoughts together. But my background is I've been a labor activist for basically my entire career, about a decade. I started, my first job out of college was as a residential mental health counselor in San Francisco, and that was represented by SEIU Local 535. I became a shop steward at the age of 22, and the rest is history, basically. I liked the union thing, and I got involved through an internship with SEIU in Minnesota, and worked on the 2004 political campaign there. And then, since then, have worked as a field representative or an organizer with SEIU, with the California Faculty Association, with AFSCME 3299 here on this campus, and with the University Council American Federation of Teachers, same union that Mike is from, for about five and a half years. So I'm also a student, I'm a master's student, I'm almost done with my master's in organizational development and knowledge management. I'm part of a cohort affiliated with the National Labor College. It's a cohort of labor activists from around the country. So we have been spending the last year and a half really contemplating the labor movement. So this is a really timely discussion for me. And I'm a mother of 2 very young children, 2.5 and 5.5, and I live here in Santa Cruz. So that's a little bit about me. I guess kind of to sort of build a little bit or take a little bit different perspective on what Mike started us off with, to kind of speak to this question about what's the role of campus union organizing, the role of university students and university unions in building a social movement. I think that Mike was talking about unions tend to really focus on the bread and butter issues, raises and benefits and all of that. When you're on a university campus, there's this whole other theoretical realm people are in, studying Marxism and whatnot. And so that brings a radicalism into the culture. And so I think that the unions benefit, the campus unions really benefit from that when you have these radical students kind of getting involved and in solidarity efforts and prompting the unions to think bigger and to take more radical actions. I can speak to that. When my experience with AFSCME 3299, we were running a contract campaign, and during that contract campaign, we did numerous civil disobedience actions, and I don't think that would have been feasible or contemplated by workers outside of this university culture. And that was because we had very radical students who were just owned their solidarity with the workers that served them on this campus, and that was part of that helped us win that campaign and make huge gains for those workers. So I think that that really serves the unions on this campus and helps them become stronger and make bigger gains. But in the process, I think the students really it's a great learning experience for the students. So we're here having a panel today. It's a small group, and I think part of that is this question of how do we learn, right? This is one way how we learn. We learn by studying theory. We learn through dialogue. But a lot of us learn our best through experiential learning, by being in action with people. And so that is, I had this one student, my first couple years of organizing here on campus, she said, I learned so much more from organizing with the workers on this campus and supporting them in their campaign than I did in any other class that I took here. And that's not to take away from the education, the courses that are being offered at this university, but it's that magic combination of theory and action that really leads to a very deep education for these students. And so I think that really can plant a lot of seeds. You have students coming out of these universities who've been part of these movements, and they take that wherever they go, whether they go to work for a labor union or they become a worker themselves. So I think that's really important, but just one kind of caution around that. It's a tricky balance to maintain with student solidarity. You want the students to infuse that kind of radical energy to be in solidarity with the workers, but not to patronize the workers and not to lead the workers. The workers should lead their own fight. And so that was always a kind of a struggle that I had as the organizer, kind of trying to balance those radical students with the workers and their comfort zones and all of that. So that's just my one kind of cautionary comment to any students in the room to sort of, check yourself on what is solidarity and make sure that you're really supporting workers so that when you graduate and leave, the workers are left feeling empowered. I think that the other thing, kind of looking at the students specifically who are involved in these solidarity efforts, it's a great leadership development opportunity for them to try on a new hat, to learn to find their voice. And in particular, that's really important for female students and students of color. Why is that? Okay, so I'm just going to read you, I've got it written down here. So there's this article in The Nation that you guys might have seen at some point. And it cited this study that was done around looking at campaign success rates for along gender lines and racial lines. And so the article is called "How the Rise of Women in Labor Could Save the Movement." Okay, this is from The Nation, January 10th, 2014. It went through Facebook, so those of you who are on Facebook probably saw it. Basically, this article and the study behind it pointed out the fact that the highest rates of union organizing now are for workers of color and for women. Okay, so that is where the labor movement can grow in terms of unionization. Campaigns that are led by women, and in particular women of color, are significantly more successful. So an NLRB campaign that is led by a female lead organizer, it has a 53% chance of winning compared to 42% for a male-led campaign. For leads of color, the campaign success rate is 58% compared to 41% to white leads. if you have a lead organizer who is a woman of color in a work site that is over 75% women of color, the win rate is 89%. Those are pretty good odds in a dismal labor movement. So this cannot be ignored. And so I just look at the university student labor solidarity as a garden for growing this next generation of women and people of color who are going to help lead this labor movement into the future. And so I guess one last point on that, I think that Mike is right, like we need a bigger vision and we need a broader social movement. And part of how you connect with all of those women and those people who are struggling now as workers to support families is to organize around working family issues, okay? And this is where I'm really happy to see Obama taking the lead now on paid sick days and paid family leave. These are essential issues that people across the political spectrum support. And so I think that, I think unions need to really prioritize those issues more in their struggles through bargaining and through supporting, community-based partnerships and legislation around these issues. So, that's kind of my vision and kind of where I think we're at and the role that I think that, social movement, union organizing on campuses can kind of help rebuild the labor movement.
Thanks.
At the end.
I want to thank Daniel for the invitation, and great to be here with so many heroes of the local left and student movement and campus labor movement. My name's Steve Early, and I've been active in one form or another of union work for about 42 years. Most of that time as a member of the Communication Workers of America. For about 30 years, I was on the CWA international staff in the Northeast. I'm currently a member of the CWA-affiliated newspaper guild in the Bay Area as a kind of an elected shop steward for its 100-member freelancers unit, people that don't work for an established employer, but scribble away trying to make a living as a freelance journalist. When I was a CWA rep, I had the benefit of working with a pretty diverse membership of private and public sector workers in the Northeast. Spent a lot of time with manufacturing and telecom locals. Was involved in a number of big contract campaigns and strikes and organizing campaigns involving workers at AT&T and Verizon, some of the other telephone firms. And I also had, back in the mid-90s, the great challenge of working with a terrific group of CWA-affiliated graduate student employees at State University of New York, a union called the GSEU, which, for reasons I won't get into, affiliated with CWA, and after a long legal struggle in the late 80s, early 90s, was finally able to establish the fact that they were workers, not students, under the New York public sector bargaining law. And so I was assigned to help them on their first couple of contracts statewide, involving a unit of about 5,000 TAs and some research foundation people. The first contract negotiated with the previous Cuomo administration, and then his successor, Republican by the name of Pataki. So I got quite a bit of exposure 20 years ago to the exciting possibilities that both Mike and Allison talked about of representing and working with a strata of the public university workforce, which is kind of strategically placed, one foot in the camp of activism in the case of many of its core members, another foot in academia, heavily concentrated in the sociology departments of, of Stony Brook, Albany, Binghamton, and Buffalo, as I recall, but a wonderful training ground for future union activists. Some of CWA's best organizers actually were people who got their start in the GSEU/CWA, fell off the academic track, got so involved in contract bargaining and mobilization and organizing political action, they never finished their doctoral work.
Shocking.
Academia's loss was CWA's gain. Some eventually got back on the academic track. One former president, Tom Reifer, is now a sociology professor down in San Diego. So there are some people who've continued to make their mark as professors.
Former student from here.
What's that?
A former student from here, actually.
A former student, yeah. So a great guy who said to say hello. Anyway, I in the mid-90s, the GSEU, even though it had only just won bargaining rights and was kind of at the end of the line of a long list of state worker unions that had been around a lot longer, were much bigger, had much more influence and clout, actually succeeded in playing a very catalytic role in creating a group called the Citizens Mobilization to Save New York, which formed a very activist campaign coalition to fight the budget cuts that Republican Governor Pataki introduced as soon as he got into office. That would have affected not only people at the state university system, but people reliant on other state programs. And as Mike said, this was an illustration of a union approach that didn't just involve focusing, as we had to, on getting a first contract, getting job-based employer-provided health insurance for graduate student employees and their partners and family members, something they didn't have because they had been treated as students for so many years. But there were enough people with a broader vision of what the university should be or could be, who had enough grounding in left politics of one sort or another, that the graduate student employees, only 4,000 or 5,000 strong, were actually able to drag AFSCME, the university professors, the Public Employees Federation, a number of the bigger players in public sector collective bargaining in New York at that time, into a kind of more grassroots approach than they had been used to, like many public employee unions in that era, and still sadly today, all of them had big Albany-based lobbying operations. They were inside players, very involved in electoral politics in a kind of traditional way, and really underutilizing the tremendous potential of their own rank-and-file membership spread all over the state in all kinds of different state jobs. So anyway, another example of how newcomers, people not yet accultured in the labor movement, with somewhat unorthodox ideas about how you bargained and mobilized and engaged in political action, played a very, very positive role at one particular point in the history of unionism at the State University in New York. I just want to say that one of the ways that people on the left in the labor movement have tried to institutionalize some of the approaches that both Mike and Allison have talked about is through a network called Labor Notes. Brother Tom has been a long-time Bay Area supporter of it. Labor Notes got started 35 years ago as a network of union activists. It functions both as a labor education project outside the university and outside the confines of what's left of union-based worker education. It conducts its own schools and conferences. It publishes a monthly newsletter. It acts as a clearinghouse for rank-and-file activity in support of strikes, international solidarity campaigns, brainstorming about new organizing strategy and tactics, new ways of doing politics independent of the two-party system, and has sustained itself as what Allison would call a community of practice. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
For 35 years, which I think is a very important organizational accomplishment. To be that kind of long-distance runner really takes the founding members of the group, who were part of one left sect group, functioning in a more ecumenical way back in the 1970s and 80s than maybe some other groups did on the left, trying to create a kind of broad tent under which a range of left-inspired union activists and a lot of indigenous militants. Usually the majority of people in the Labor Notes Network to this day are people who don't come out of any party or movement background so much as people who've been radicalized or become more militant just based on their day-to-day experiences as workers or union members. So Tom and I and many others have long been involved in Labor Notes. I've brought some samples of its excellent monthly newsletter. One of Labor Notes' most recent projects is a book called How to Jumpstart Your Union. So if you're feeling that your union, like too many, is stalled out, broken down by the side of the road, having engine trouble or battery problems, this is the owner's manual for you, How to Jumpstart Your Union. Subtitle is Lessons of the Chicago Teachers, one of the shining examples of social movement unionism, social justice unionism, labor notes type unionism in recent years has been the Chicago Teachers Union. Their strike in 2012 was an inspiration and a great model for both public sector workers and private sector union activists throughout the country. One of the biggest and most successful anti-concession struggles in recent years. The CTU, the transformation of that local, is a big part of the story of this book. But the book tries to apply the lessons of the CTU experience to a lot of other union settings, and I think people will find it to be a useful tool. It emphasizes, of course, the importance of union democracy and reform. The Chicago Teachers Union would not be the local union that it is today if there had not been rank and file activists, people from various left groups coming together, forming a reform caucus, running candidates for office, taking over the local, and not just taking it over, but trying to transform its institutional culture, empower the members, do all the things that Allison and Mike were recommending in other settings. And so I would highly recommend How to Jumpstart Your Union. And why don't I stop there, and we'll take some questions, and I'm sure have a lively discussion with our very experienced and well-informed audience here.
Well, first, thanks, Dustin. Well, first, I'd actually like to give you all a chance to respond to one another. So if you could do so, responding to any of the points that you found of interest, or any of the points that corresponded with these questions that you'd like to respond to.
I think just amplified something that both Allison and Steve said, which is the question of how people learn, let's say how they learn democracy. It turns out, I don't think anybody would disagree with me about this, that people don't really learn about, actually they might learn about, but they don't learn to practice democracy in a 9th grade civics class, and they don't learn it much in a government class at the university level either. Not that there aren't useful things happening in both of those places, but I think most of us, myself included, and most people who are become activists learn the practice of democracy by doing it, by being actually involved in working on things. And so if you think about in earlier times in the United States and throughout Europe and other places, people had institutions where they actually got connected to community in some way. And we might romanticize it a bit, but it's not completely off to say, women in the colonial America used to be involved in quilting bees, and men put up barns together, and people who were active in churches actually had a social component to it where you'd have to compromise with other people and figure out how you were going to build your church physically, the building itself, and how you were going to provide services or not to your congregation. And in politics, people might belong to, say, the Democratic Party, but they would actually belong to the party. They were active in it. They went to meetings that happened once a week or once a month and actually got a chance to learn how to make a decision with other people, how to project a vision and build a strategy to get to win some outcome, as opposed to you become a member of the Democratic Party because you registered Democratic. You maybe never have ever been to a meeting or talked to another Democrat, literally, and could still be a member of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. people at churches, in Southern California, do this drive-in churches now. You drive in your car, you put the speaker in your window, you listen to the sermons, you drive out and drop your money in the collection box. You never get out of your car and meet with another person, so you don't build even a church community, much less a kind of civic community within the community in the town where you live. So the idea of getting people active in actually experiencing a strike, seeing that you can actually win something, that you have a problem you're concerned about, and you work together with your workmates and discover you can change it, that you can actually, if you get together and work on it and think about who has the power to change that, who would we have to have as our allies to be successful with that, and you build that movement yourself and see it happen, that's what makes somebody into an activist, not because somebody gave them a great inspiring talk. Again, not that we don't need some inspiring talks, but the issue comes down to the practical possibility of learning these kinds of skills, how to run a meeting, how to go knock on a door, how to talk one-to-one with somebody else about politics, which is usually not something people do very much in their lives, how to create a culture of enjoyment with other people instead of just watching television passively by yourself. And so the union movement needs to be providing that opportunity for people if it's going to be successful at all. Because it's not reading a book that teaches you how to be a part of a democratic society. It's the actual practice of arguing with somebody and coming to a compromise where both of you feel like you have more working together than if you worked alone. And you can tell people forever, there's strength in solidarity. If we all work together, we can get more than if we individually. People hear that, but it doesn't mean very much till they see it happen. Oh, because we got together, because we worked with people across union barriers, because we broke out of the university community with people in the town, because we were successful in connecting political work with our actual day-to-day teaching work or something, we've actually accomplished the following kinds of things. And they feel it for themselves, and they own that in a way that you can never teach that to somebody purely by talking at them or giving them a book or an article to read or something. So I thought those were really important points that both of you were making about that being such a key issue about what the labor movement needs to do to actually give people a sense of possibility.
Allison?
I guess, I think Mike just briefly touched on earlier this sort of idea of how, the unions are doing a lot of defensive work. Again, I kind of called it dealing with bread and butter issues. But the way that work is done often mimics the way management and the way corporations do their work. And I think sometimes even worse because I think I just was reading Education for Changing Unions. Bev Burke and Darcy Martin and a few other authors wrote this book about popular education and unions, and they were talking about union culture. And they were kind of saying you have workers who are really disempowered in many aspects of their lives. And so they have a real strong sense of loyalty to their unions, but also kind of entitlement, and they want control over their union, understandably so, right? But I think what happens is that we get into a real fight mentality, a real either or black and white kind of mentality, and I think that sometimes that is what is needed to reform and transform a union, but sometimes it really poisons a union. And so this is one of the hard things about union organizing. I don't know. I think it's something to become conscious of, and it's that understanding where we've sort of internalized our role as being oppressed, right? The pedagogy of the oppressed, right? We too quickly try to sort of oppress, management, or we try to take control, take power over. So I guess my question is, what does empowerment look like, and how can we both become empowered as individual workers and as a union, as a local union, but also be fluid enough and be sort of receptive enough to offer true solidarity to community groups, to build these community partnerships that are so needed right now to rebuild a large social movement, And so, I don't know, I think there's something to the union culture that we need to look at to make us better community partners.
Great, thanks. Steve?
Well, I just want to pick up quickly on one thing Allison said about the kind of complexities of student-campus worker relationships. I think there is, a danger of paternalism and being patronizing and kind of making decisions for people who should be making them themselves, but mainly just indirectly through this experience of my own two daughters, who are now both in their late 20s, but were campus-based labor solidarity activists, one at a college in New England, the other at UC Chapel Hill. What they encountered, and this was not parental bias, was these attitudes being expressed by the unions that they were trying to work with. Mm-hmm. That in fact the students often had a better, more egalitarian relationship with the cafeteria workers, with the janitors, with the shuttle bus drivers, than some of their would-be institutional helpers from organized labor. And in fact, I think like other members of USAS, they began to be a little bit critical of the way the full-time organizer, the business agent, the rep, whoever it was who had official responsibility for organizing and representing campus workers related to their own dues-paying members. And in both instances, particularly in the case of one daughter, she became a kind of de facto unpaid volunteer shop steward, filling a considerable void left by the poor representation provided a group of immigrant janitors by a large national service sector union, which shall remain unnamed. On the other point about workers of color, people of color, and the campaigns being led by women, I mean, I agree with a lot of points made in that article. I think that article, if I recall it right, reflected a somewhat narrow focus on the most oppressed, the most exploited. There's a lot of understandable interest in helping raise the minimum wage, helping fast food workers improve their terrible lot, supporting Walmart workers, supporting port truckers, supporting immigrants. I think we need to not lose sight of the other parts of a very diverse and highly stratified working class in the U.S., which includes millions of white-collar workers in the private sector. We've heard about organizing among some of their educated, more highly educated counterparts in the public sector. But in the private sector, last year, my own union had its greatest success in the airline industry, organizing passenger service employees, most of whom have 2 or 4 years of college or more. They're white collar, they're in the Southwest. They make pretty decent money, but don't have any rights in their day-to-day dealings with, in this case, American Airlines. So if you look at who organized in the airline industry last year, it was 20,000 pilots, flight attendants, and passenger service employees at Virgin, at JetBlue, at American, and none of them fit the most oppressed model of who's most organizable, though, particularly in the South, and certainly CWA's part of the American campaign, some of the best leadership was provided by women and people of color. So,
I mean, just to make another sort of follow-up, there's no question that the labor movement historically has ignored many of these left-behind farm workers, for example, historically, going back in time. But I work for a union that represents people, most of whom have, if not a library degree, a PhD, and are still treated as if they were, people that have no rights. You'd think that they would be respected for the contributions they're making and so forth, and they're definitely treated like second-class citizens. And it's definitely an organizable group. These are people that are not finding fulfillment in their jobs. And you would think if you've got your PhD and you're teaching, and you have some control of your work. It's not, I've worked on an assembly line, it's a lot more freedom than an assembly line has. It still doesn't mean that you can't be deeply abused and have you be exploited for the labor that you're carrying on and not offered the opportunity to fulfill yourself through your work. So I think your point's really well taken. It's a matter of combining these movements and not ignoring either the highly educated folks that are being abused, nor the people who are at the bottom of the chain economically and being abused in terms of the direct dollar issues primarily.
Okay, great. Well, let's go ahead and open this up to the audience. I do hope at some point that we do address one of the questions: what relationship should public universities have to national democratic parties, and whether or not university unions can be used to as a strategy to revitalize left politics as well. But before we go into that, you're all welcome to ask me any questions you wish. Anybody have
Even
anything?
add a comment.
What do you think?
Do a little Democratic Party bashing.
Yes.
Thank you for the talk. I'm sorry I came in late, but I have a couple of questions. How does new technologies work or don't work towards the revitalization of social movement unionization? And if it works, how are you using it tactically or strategically? If you can give us an example, that would be great. And another thing, how do you navigate differences within union movements, racial, gender, or any other kind of differences?
I would, again, it's only a very partial answer to a very important question. Our union found, we got very active in the struggle to get budget reform in California, and California was melting down in terms of its budget arrangements, and our union played a particular role, along with the California Federation of Teachers in general, but particularly the University Council, the American Federation of Teachers, in taking on statewide issues that were not even about education, about various forms of state support, welfare issues, programs, health programs for people who have nothing to do with universities or higher education. And what we found is a lot of our members are much more excited by those kinds of issues, actually, than even their question of their own immediate. They were willing to get involved in the union and step up, and once they were there, made us stronger in terms of taking on our particular issues on the campus in relation to our employer, the university. But what got people to come to meetings was the announcement they were going to take on questions about the state budget, its impact on K-12 education, its impact on various kinds of state clients that are receiving absolutely necessary services, disabled community, and so forth. And so sometimes it's not the most, the immediate need that the person has, again, for defending the narrow aspects of their job, but trying to understand how we can live in a different kind of society that actually will mobilize members. And once they get there, they're available to help you deal with the immediate issues of your own contract. And we actually mobilized quite a few people around that struggle that I think would not have come to a meeting to talk about the salaries at UC or something in a more focused, narrow kind of a question. And different people have different reactions to that, but I think that's kind of a key. And again, because people in art that we're organizing in higher education are often teaching in areas that relate to broader social questions and so forth, not narrowly focused on a university question, I think they're quite interested in these broader social questions, and you can mobilize them in ways that you might find more difficult in other kinds of unions. So I think it's a lost opportunity when you don't find ways to connect the struggles you're involved in for, say, worker control in the workplace with the same issue as it's confronted by people who are doing very different kinds of work and are concerned about their lack of ability to control safety on the shop floor of an industrial job, or their ability in a white-collar job unrelated to university to have some autonomy in the way they carry out their work and not be treated as if they're just cogs in some machine. And so there are ways to make links in a broader labor movement out of their direct teaching experience that our members have here as librarians or as lecturers in the university system.
I would just say to both of your questions, it varies. So technology, social media, some unions I think are really advancing their use of that, and some are not. And sometimes that's for good reason. Like when I represented the service workers on this campus, they're not in front of computers, and I guess they increasingly have cell phones, but the best way to talk to them was to go and talk to them in person, or with a printed flyer. Whereas where I represented the lecturers on this campus, it was all email. It was like email nonstop.
She made a video too.
I've made videos to run campaigns to get attention to things, increasing use of Facebook, that kind of thing. The AFL-CIO and other unions have like they're increasingly using like texting, and you can kind of sign up for that stuff. They also they have like a young, what do they call it? 21st century something or other. They've got like a young thing, like a convention that they have every year to try to build more younger leaders, and I think they try to include a lot of technology with that. And I think with navigating differences, again, it really varies. And I think I would say that in the places where they're that you have really stagnant leadership bodies that have been the same leaders for years and years and years and decades and decades and decades. Like, that's an issue. Like, for me, like, the labor movement is about empowerment, it's about leadership development, and it's about reflecting the demographics of the people that that are part of that union. And so I think that there could be done a lot more happening to revitalize the leadership development in all of these unions. And that means relinquishing power sometimes of very experienced, very dedicated, amazing leaders who I hope that they'll become mentors, to new generations. The issue is that a huge percentage of union members are going to be retiring. I mean, they're baby boomers. They're getting ready to retire. I think Ask Me International, it's like half of their members are going to be retiring in the next 10 years. So, there's going to be a huge loss of knowledge, and so the time is now to really be both, navigating differences, but specifically cultivating a younger generation, a new generation of leaders.
Well, let me just talk about the social media question. All of those were really good. But I think that the one interesting to me aspect of union use of technology is the way that it has a lot of bottom-up, unofficial rank and file uses. And unions, bureaucracies, of course, have gotten with the program. They have websites, they have listservs, they collect email addresses, they have social media experts. Their top officials have ghostwritten Twitter accounts. To me, the most impressive breakthrough is when the rank and file kind of grabs the technological tools and runs with them. Sure. One example of that would be the biggest coordinating aspect of the biggest strike in the last 10 years, which was the Verizon strike in 7 states, the Mid-Atlantic and Northeastern states in 2011. 45,000 members of CWA and IBW, a group that I worked with for many years. They had a campaign mobilization kickoff in January of that year, kind of a semi-official event that I was involved in. The contract wasn't up until August of 2011. People at that meeting of 100 stewards set up a Facebook page called IBW CWA Ready to Strike at Verizon, like 6 months before the contract deadline. This was not run by IBW hierarchy or the CWA hierarchy. This was mobilization coordinators, stewards, right? And, hey, Facebook, how much more democratic than that can you get? They ended up, by expiration date, with 5,000 or 6,000 people. More people were going to this Facebook site for information than to either of the official union sites, kind of embarrassing. And people were posting stuff they were doing, their workplace actions, their solidarity activity, their informational practice picketing, everything that helped lead up to a 2-week strike, which was kind of a standoff, not a success necessarily, but very militant. And during the strike, people used this same Facebook page to post pictures of mobile picketing and confrontations with the police. 100 people were fired in that 2-week period, possibly as a result of some things they learned to do on Facebook. Both national unions got very concerned about what was being posted so openly on this Facebook page, became a little bit more carefully moderated. But, this was the first time that workers themselves, the rank and file leadership, in a very complicated multi-state bargaining unit involving 2 national unions, took this kind of initiative. And people love the sharing of information, the modeling of best practices, and learning, what people in other locals were doing. If their local wasn't doing it, then hey, we're going to go out and do it ourselves, like people in all these other places are doing. So I think we need 2, 3, many examples of that in a lot of situations, rather than more top-down control of social media by some of our union organizations.
Yeah. Good point.
Question?
Thomas.
Go ahead.
Tom Edminster, still on my union's executive board of the San Francisco Teachers Union, government of the San Francisco Labor Council, co-chaired a committee on labor education in the California Federation of Teachers on and off for 20 years. Social movement unionism by itself, in the absence of looking at the limits of contract unionism and what Leonard called economism, is a problematic. Michael well raised kind of the motivational issues I think that some workers feel in relation to broader questions. But until enough folks in the House of Labor embrace real participatory democracy and at least have some modest orientation toward some kind of social democratic program with an ecological perspective, I think talking about social movement unionism is a fallacy. As well articulated, lots of people have no experience in real democracy till they do the face-to-face organizing. Then the questions become, in the waves of organizing and developing a contract, how do you maintain participation? How do you deal with questions of inequality and privilege over the long run and build an inclusive culture? And nobody, even that wonderful book, answers those questions well because there are no magic bullets. But I think talking about social movement unionism while we live in the center of world imperialism on a dying planet without addressing some fundamental problems of social reproduction is limited. And I think we're in a tremendous biological and political crisis globally and in the United States in an absence of any kind of politics of the Commonwealth or progressive left. I mean, you know, finally Elizabeth Warren is talking about public investment in drugs. I'm like, God, at least modest social democracy is emerging. But beyond workplace power, the whole question of the public sector and democratizing the public sector and public enterprises and saving what's left, which means building those links outside your workplace and having alliances of public sector unions that are real and not just built on electoral cycles, I think remains a problem of, I think, a real future of social movement unionism, which says goods and services, air, water, parks, recreation, education, all need to be about all of us. And that, I think, is an important part of anything deserving social movement unionism. I mean, the phrase, our Walmart, makes me cringe, even though it's a movement of people who are, you know, developing strength to fight for a minimum wage, in expanded retail, blah, 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 blah. But it's crap. I mean, the notion of like, how did Walmart even come to exist as the largest employer in the United States without massive control?
Largest employer in the world.
Right, yeah, and the grotesque crushing of U.S. manufacturing and outsourcing. I mean, but those are all questions of political economy, which I think we need to train more cadre in political economy and popular education so people understand a lot of what's happened to this political economy and culture in the last 30 years. So we can have some analysis of beyond work. What's happened to work? What is work? Are we producing useful things or not? How can that be changed? All the issues you raised about a conflict orientation versus what I'll call a problem solving or a relational orientation, I think are fundamental because we need to be about rotation of work and divisions of labor and all those things. In my work site, I was the steward for about 18 of the 24 years I taught in high school, and we'd have monthly meet and confer with management, which were mandated. And most of those years I dealt with management that did not want to cope with other problems. But from the grassroots, from the people I worked with, it's like, no, we need you to deal with this, and we want you to deal with this, and we want you to deal with this. All beyond the contract issues, which they should have, by rights, problem solved about, but which were fundamental to the function of a comprehensive high school of 2,000 to 3,000 kids and 100 and 130 employees. Anyway, I think social movement unionism is another good idea, and I think there have been massive social upheavals, and I think there will continue to be, but I think the program and the vision needs to be both about democracy, responsibility for the administration of things, and the larger social fabric, including defense and transformation of the public sector. I tried to be brief, but I'm done.
Good point.
I'll piggyback on that, if that's okay. My name is Elyse Caspian, and I'm a local activist. I've seen Mike for a long time, mostly just showing up at things like city council or activist events. And I'm really refreshed to hear what this gentleman just said. I'm sorry I missed your name there, sir.
Tom.
I can't tell you how refreshed I am to hear what he said. And that's because I've spent my lifetime, actually, as an adult, basically moving around from one place to another as a worker, as an activist, and in other capacities. I'll just leave that blank for now. And really just not finding really viable places to hook in where there was a lot of traction. So having said that, I think everything you all are saying is really important. But as somebody, for example, who went to the College of Environmental Design in Boulder, because I was young, it was an exciting program, I very quickly started learning about sustainability. That particular college didn't work for me, but the college was shut down, probably by oil interests in Denver. And here we are, 35 years later. I think some of the most exciting social movements right now are really looking at the influence of big oil on the two parties, including the Democrats. And I just want to say, I've really had a worthy history as an activist. I'll just posit that without anybody necessarily needing to buy in there. But I'm an extraordinarily alienated person. I was a mental health worker early on during the Reagan years. I was very creative in setting up my career, and it was just bludgeoned by Reagan. And I did not have any education at that point. I came from a fairly affluent family. My dad loved unions, but he didn't need one. He was a pretty affluent lawyer. He argues that he did need one. He benefited from that. But what I'm saying is I really had to go back to school in the real world, learning that I was a worker and I was getting bludgeoned. And so I just want to say, over the years, I've ended up leading a voting rights movement in San Diego. For that, I was basically investigated by the FBI, but when that happened, I think we were set up, and it was an environmental talk that was set up. And I'll just say, we prevailed. I kept my community intact. It took a lot of organizing, a lot of which I learned outside of school, outside of class. And I just, again, I think what this gentleman has to say here is really, really important. And I'm just kind of throwing things out there. And the reason is for example, here in Santa Cruz, there's a lot of agreement about these statistics, okay? Santa Cruz has been hugely gentrified in the last 30, 40 years. And there are roughly, it's agreed, about 3,500 plus homeless people here. 70% of those people were born or substantially grew up here, okay? Over 70%, that's really a refugee population that has been displaced by economics. Virtually, literally, and I'm really doing my homework on this on the ground, nobody is really addressing the fact that we need really, really affordable, as in probably free, transitional housing. I mean, let's start with a third of that population. This is a dream, of course, but let's say we could get 1,000 simple housing units for a year that people could get while they look for actual housing, which we'd also have to build. Free or very, very truly affordable housing while people reestablish themselves in what jobs? I mean, what jobs? So I guess what I'm really trying to say here is that I'm extraordinarily alarmed. And I have been a labor activist. I've worked a lot for these unions. As particularly one strike I was active in was the food workers strike in Southern California. And that's where I went back to school and I took classes at a community college about labor. So I'm just saying, I think, the first thing that unions need to admit is that we're basically, as Mike says, really admit the baseline. Totally failing. Just really totally failing. Does that mean we're hopeless? No. I think there's a lot of hope here, but really we need to rebuild. And I think the best way to really rebuild is to start aligning with all these movements outside the Democratic Party, outside the old boy network, and I mean, sorry, but, old boy white racist network that women have tried oftentimes to emulate, and really, really start looking at the broader movements, like how can we use direct action and strikes?
The question would be, what role would campus-based unions play in addressing these sort of larger social structural issues?
Yeah, and can I just really quick, I'll say 2 sentences on that.
Well,
a lot of the people who are staffing...
Let's make it brief so the panelists can respond.
Oh, okay. Can I just add on?
Sure, of course.
In looking very deeply into the services that are being provided outside, of course, students aren't being employed. Wherever possible, students graduating are not being employed. They're employing people who are often, for example, in the housing, in the homeless areas, people who are still drug addicts, people who are sometimes have no educational background, and the groups that are providing these services, which are very, very minimal and don't really address the full problem, are not even people with educations in these areas of any kind. So I just wanted to say that, because I think these are really, really real problems.
Any responses to either of the comments?
Well, and what related maybe to both. So much stuff goes back to the kind of one-on-one conversations that you need to have with members if you're going to figure out what does excite them and where the possibilities lie. And I think often the problem is leadership makes some decision. Let's make a turn to connecting to a particular social issue. They haven't worked it out with their members, and then you have a split in your union in which half the people think, why don't you get back to basics? It's all about money for me. Maybe whatever the percentages are, if it's half, but a significant portion, and another significant portion are really excited by this for the first time. We're now going to do something about a broad social issue that's not necessarily about our narrow interests. And there's only one way to overcome that division. It's by talking to people and getting some idea and bringing people along and talking to people as individuals to get an accurate reading on where people are willing to go. You cannot impose a socialist vision on a bunch of people that have never thought about the question. You start with very direct kinds of discussions about them, what interests them, what concerns them. And in those discussions you often find, especially when you're working with women or people of color, their number one concern is not necessarily the workload question in their job, or it's not necessarily focused on a particular issue about the money or some other kind of question. It may well be about something in the community that's a concern that the union could weigh in on, but you'll never know that if you don't get involved in those discussions. And for too many years, I'm not going to make it sound like it's easy, or it's just like, oh, well, if these people were smarter in the labor movement, they just go do this thing. But it's really where things have to go, where you have these like much more contact with members and seemingly aimless discussions for a period of time until you actually find out what your members are concerned about and what matters to them. And most unions are not doing very much of that kind of grassroots work. It's kind of, we're too busy, we're too much behind the eight ball, we've got to get this thing done this week. Elections are coming up, we've got to make sure that we don't have somebody bad on the school board that's going to vote, won't give us the salary increases we want or something. You don't have to also do that work, but more fundamental questions about what are people's interests, what are they willing to struggle over, what would excite them enough to become the leader of a labor movement or a union. And you don't know that till you talk to them one-on-one. I've been doing a lot of that work recently. I've been hired back after leaving my leadership positions in the union. I'm hired gun now. I go to campuses and they use recruit talking about that our audience have brought up as an issue here. I think those are kind of critical, having those one-on-one conversations, finding out what people care about, and then turning those into actual action movements that achieve some victories in those issues that matter to your members.
Any further responses?
Well, I really like what Tom shared, and I'm sorry, what was your name again? Elyse. Yeah. I think these are the tough problems that our community is facing, and but this starts in the schools, right? I mean, No Child Left Behind, teaching to test. What are we doing to, our population? We're teaching them to be obedient, to pass tests, and where are we inspiring this sense of you can have an impact, you can make changes, you can be a leader. And so, unfortunately, that also gets mirrored in a lot of unions, in the hierarchical structure and the long-standing leadership, where people feel like they defer to leaders just like they deferred to their parents, and they deferred to their teachers, and they defer to their bosses. They wait for somebody to make a plan and to take them there. And so, this is messy business. This isn't just about what unions on this campus are doing. This is about what is happening in our schools, this school, and in the preschools and the kindergartens at all levels. I say that, though, to bring it back to the technology thing, because the technology and what you talked about, Steve, the way that it decentralizes people's ability to organize. So we don't anymore have to wait for sanction from a union president to say, go run this campaign and here's your message and here's your plan. Like, it can just happen. And actually, there's a lot of stories about how some of the most effective and long-lasting social movements have been decentralized like that. There's this book called The Spider and the Starfish, I think, right? Like, if you chop off a limb of a spider, it dies, right? But if you, I don't know. Basically, the idea is, like, create these spontaneous networks, this ability for leaders to emerge all over at any time that have the tools and the technology, to do something about it. So, I'm hopeful in that sense that we have new tools. In terms of these really tough problems, these hairballs, about the environment and about housing, I think Mike's right. I think it comes back to community building and having relationships so that you don't just hear about somebody's lack of housing, but you care about them and you want them to be in a safe, sheltered place where they, can have a good job. And again, the technology could facilitate that to a degree. I hope that unions on this campus and the students that are part of them can really embrace that need for community building, not just up here, on the hill, but down in town too. And that's hard because students cycle right in and out every 4 years or every 7 years.
Yeah, it's not every 4 years, unfortunately.
Well, but to say this is my community and I'm going to be a part of it. And to the extent that teachers on this campus are kind of, and Mike led the field study program through the community studies, program department for many, many years, and that was amazing because it brought all these students into community organizations. We need gateways like that.
I'm going to save my argument with Brother Tom over the naming of our Walmart for after the meeting. And I know what he's talking about. Our Verizon doesn't have a very good ring either. I want to talk about Lisa's point about the pernicious influence of big oil on both major parties. I mean, one little ray of light and hope on that front was the big election victory we had in Richmond last November 4th. It just happened to be written up in this January issue of Labor Notes, the headline, Unbought Slate Against Chevron Democrats. I won't go into the whole history of 10 years of base building by the Richmond Progressive Alliance, very similar to the work that Mike and his comrades did with SCAN and their whole progressive electoral movement here in Santa Cruz back in the 80s. But one of the things that enabled a progressive slate in nonpartisan city council and mayoral elections last fall to overcome $3.5 billion worth of corporate spending, mainly from Chevron, was relationship building and creating a sense of community, turning the whole election into a referendum on whose community is this, the oil companies or ours, and getting out there, like in any good contract campaign, 6 or 7 months before the voting starts, knocking on doors, canvassing, IDing voters, and talking to people about the issues before they get hit with the $3.1 million air war from corporate America, Chevron division, which ended up backfiring in this case. But you have to do the grassroots work or you're not going to win in Richmond or anywhere else. So I check that out.
That's terrific. Thank you.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you pointing that out.
I have a couple of questions and comments myself that I'm going to throw out there. So, Mike, you started off the conversation by referring to Rosa Luxemburg, and an interesting point that you bring up is now that unions were once, they were fulfilling a role that was more economistic, fighting for economic gains. Now they're kind of forced into a position where they're actually fighting for sort of larger social gains, but where's the direction coming from? Where's the leadership coming from? We've talked a lot about community building. My question is, can we expect a sort of dispersed community to play a leadership role in the unions automatically? Where is the leadership coming from? The thing you brought up, Steve, about the Chicago Teachers Union. The Solidarity is playing a leadership role. The Trotskyist organization Solidarity is playing a leadership role in the core caucus, and the vice president Sharkey is a member of the ISO, International Socialist Organization. Ostensibly, these organizations do have a vision of socialism. What sort of leadership role is required of these organizations? Are they viable left? Are these left organizations viable in terms of dealing with these sort of maximalist, large social issue restructuring of society problems?
Start again. Sorry. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a fan of the work that's been done by the International Socialist Organization activists who are definitely very committed to the ongoing work of rebuilding the Chicago Teachers Union, along with independent leftists, people from other left groups, and thousands of rank-and-file teachers who are Democrats, Republicans, and who knows what else in Chicago. I mean, I think the key difference lately, and it's a good, healthy contrast to the situation maybe on the left of the labor movement in the 1980s, is that there's a lot less rivalry and infighting and competition among the left groups that have members in particular sectors. And I think when people come together, set aside some of their political, doctrinal differences in the interest of building a union reform caucus or union democracy movement on a more ecumenical basis, they have far greater chance of success, building a base beyond their own already committed left political group membership, and ultimately involving a lot more members in a bigger picture approach to the union's day-to-day work. The problem in Chicago, without going into all the gory details, is exactly what Mike described. You're up against Rahm Emanuel, the whole corporate-backed education reform juggernaut, a lot of local powers that be that want to crush this union, want to privatize the schools, want to turn public education over to the charter school system, and the CTU has produced a lot of documents that I think are pretty impressive, projecting an alternative vision of how public education in Chicago and elsewhere could be revitalized and improved and made to work better for parents and teachers in the community than it does. But they are spending a lot of time in a defensive crouch, fighting school closings, fighting concessions, fighting attacks on their pensions and benefits. And I think it's very hard for people to maintain that kind of balance that both Mike and Allison talked about.
It'll sound naive, but the probably number one function for whether that activity among leftists can be helpful or harmful comes down to whether people are better at listening than talking. I mean, it's a pretty fundamental kind of a concept, but our success in Santa Cruz politically, I was part of a little socialist feminist group in the American movement. Probably had 1,200 members nationally total. Maybe that's probably slightly exaggerated, even 1,000 members. But we started off with a sense of how we might build a socialist movement in Santa Cruz, and then we decided we started first tried to lobby the board of supervisors about reopening the public hospital that had been closed. Realized we had no base, that they weren't going to listen to us. Started to go out in the neighborhoods and organize a base in Santa Cruz, and when we got there, we found that people whose doors we knocked on wanted health care, more access to health care desperately, but didn't want to reopen the county hospital. Our most fundamental goal was not of no interest to them. That was like poor people's medicine. They didn't really want it. They wanted a sliding scale fee clinic of some kind so that low-income people could afford it, but not different medicine than the people of middle income that could afford decent care. And amazingly enough, we heard that message and changed our goal. There's so many left groups go out working in the labor movement or working on social issues or labor unions when they go in to make a community connection, think they know exactly what needs to happen. Doesn't matter what everybody tells them. They get in these one-on-one conversations and they talk at the people that they're trying to work with, and they never hear a word about what those people would be excited to work on or how they might connect. And that's the difference. When the ISO is being successful in something, it's because there was a time when they weren't listening to anybody and had their own sense of stuff. And it's because they began thinking, well, what does the wider movement in the labor and in the community really need to be working on? And changed their strategy and their goals and everything else. And it's a two-way street. I think we ended up influencing the political movement in Santa Cruz, the neighborhood culture and stuff, made it a lot more populist and progressive than it would have been, left as a homeowners associations, which are typically very conservative. But that wouldn't have happened if we hadn't listened to them and changed our goals about what we were trying to accomplish in those neighborhoods, that we didn't have the answer for what all these working people needed on the west side of Santa Cruz. That's not easy to do. Most people that get excited about activism think they've got a message, think they've got something that people need to hear, think they know what the world should be, and the idea that, and that's important. You got to go out there with a sense that you wanted to accomplish something, that you do have a vision of a better and different world. But if you go out there with that vision narrowed and a clear sense that you have all the answers and it doesn't matter how people respond to your vision, you're going to be in big trouble and be as irrelevant as most of the left has been in this country for the last 50 years.
Was your question, where are the leaders in the labor movement who may lead a big picture social, what was it, movement?
Basically, what would the role of the left be in labor movements? What would the leadership role be in terms of politics that can change society fundamentally?
I think you're trying to introduce those things. see what Wright. See who's interested in in talking to people about those issues, and again, with a little respect and not arrogance about how correctly that might be the most important issue to them or whatever, and then you see if there's interest in that, and you see how you can unite that with goals that they have in their lives and interests and stuff. And that turns out to often be very successful. That it does bring ideas that would otherwise probably not be there if you hadn't brought them up and made them happen. But if you hold on to your idea with fierceness that you're going to get everybody to buy into your program and your goal, and they're going to sign up for your political party or your, even your program, without modifying that program in dramatic ways, almost turning it, never 180 degrees, but dramatically against the direction you started off in, you're not going to be very successful in bringing that labor movement into the social struggles. But it's possible to do it. I think I've seen that happen. And if you're willing to be flexible in how you meet with people and talk with them and listen to their concerns, that works very, very well. It's very hard. It takes a lot of time. It's not easy work. It's unfortunate we live in a society where people have learned that you can get everything on the shelf. It's like go to the store and buy what you need.
Yeah.
And the idea that some things take a long time, that the neighborhood group that we built didn't have a meeting for 2 years. We spent 2 years just talking one-on-one, knocking on doors, having picnics and social events and learning who lived there and what their families and needs were about and stuff. Most people now, if you can't get something going in about a month, gosh, we've been working on this for 6 weeks, nothing's happened, let's do something else. Nothing happens in 6 weeks. That's the problem.
Well, speaking as a union representative, and this kind of goes back to something Steve had mentioned earlier, a story about a custodial group of workers who weren't getting their needs met by their union officials. In the day-to-day work of a union, it's really hard. Like, you have workers who are really getting screwed, and you really want to help them with their issues. Whatever, they're getting disciplined unjustly, or your contract negotiations, whatever that is, you really want to do a good job. And also, I believe that is how that creates a sense of pride and value around the union when you're really able to service your members effectively. The challenge, though, is you ask, well, where do these really radical left politics come in, these bigger picture issues? So you have unions like SEIU, which I've worked for, who have tried to have a very strong, bigger picture political program going, that the union reps, the organizers, are expected to try to juggle this, like really high expectations around big picture politics and meeting the needs of your members. And sometimes I felt like that sacrificed the ability of us to serve our members. And I think that can bite you in the butt, because then those members feel disenfranchised by their union, and then unions get a bad rap. And so it's a really, on a day-to-day level, it's really hard, because there's something very radical about really working with a particular worker in a particular work site, and helping them out and lifting them up, that can carry us somewhere. But I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot of innovation happening outside of the collective bargaining, unionist world. There's the Restaurant Organizing Center based in Oakland, ROC. They're doing some great work around all the low-wage workers who work in restaurants. You have Moms Rising, which is mostly an online social media kind of network, but they're doing some great advocacy in Washington, D.C. So, I mean, I think part of it is that union leaders need to kind of tap into and be receptive to those powerful, innovative movements that are happening outside of the collective bargaining units and partner, right? I don't know. I just don't think there's an easy answer to your question. That's, I guess, my point.
Thanks.
If nothing else, it helps to have the unions at least think that this matters. So in our union, we've done some training on what we call community liaison work, because you need to have people that will do that work, and they maybe don't know how to get started or something. So we've done workshops and sort of beginning to get some people who are committing that they'll take that issue seriously and bring those issues into the meetings of our local union and bring the ideas from our union into the work that they're involved in the community around broader housing issues which affect our members as well and their children. But you begin that process and you try and actually feed it in some way rather than just hope it happens or something.
And we haven't talked a lot about the California Federation of Teachers. I mean, Tom, you could probably speak to this, but this is a very strategic union in terms of, I think, balancing meeting the needs of members and really strategic, powerful political action. And this goes way back to let's do an education campaign around talking to people about taxes. Right, and that was a precursor to the Millionaire's Tax Campaign, which turned into Prop 30, right? So important that Prop 30 got passed. That's vital to all the schools and all the public services and people of California, right? And then even before that, it was CFT leading the way on the majority budget bill, so the Democrats don't get blackmailed at the last minute by all the Republicans in the California legislature so that they can pass better budgets. And that's helped us, keep the budget process moving. It's not perfect, but so I think, CFT is a really good example of really figuring out strategic political fights and, is still really empowering and meeting the needs of the members on the local level. Would you agree with that, Tom?
We're far away from where Tom wants to end up, that's for sure.
I mean, but take some credit, right?
I have to be polite. It's not as glittery as you apologize. Because, the CFT is different from the association, is essentially a coalition of locals bounded by a state. So no matter who you elect to be president of the CFT, we've had lesser or worse leadership at the state level. You have still, it's an organization of locals. There's some social vision which has stayed in the CFT, distinct from the AFT, from the days of the civil rights movement and fighting on behalf of affirmative action and pissing Al Shanker off. So there's still a residue of left culture that permeates somewhat the CFT in its current leadership and affiliation. But at the base level, changing the culture of locals and talking long range, not just about Prop 30 and the millionaire's tax, but long-range shift in fiscal reform. How do we get away from an austerity state? How do we fully fund not just education? That's a longer, messier task. I pushed early, even before Brother Peshtal was president, on the whole fair tax thing. We needed to work on post-Prop 13 for years, working on developing the talking taxes stuff. But at the base level, using it, that remains an open question. How can you motivate that? Besides re-electing Torlakson in the face of an utter dork reactionary, do we have an alternative vision for public education in the state of California? The whole notion of the master plan has been under fiscal assault and being undermined for decades. And so we still have to get back to what's accessible public education and adequate public education in the state of California, because honestly, CFA and the CSU unions sold out students years ago in bargaining. Students, we'll just fight for our piece of pie. So as public sector unions, and the CFT has been exemplary, I have to say, among public sector unions, in not just fighting for our piece of pie, but we have to move politically beyond our piece of pieism, particularly in public sector unions. And I don't think CFT leadership can do it alone. And we have had the positive effect, I think, of pushing the more bureaucratic paternalist older sibling, other sibling, the CTA, into a better kind of politics. But it's still a bureaucratic, paternalistic culture inside CTA. And in San Francisco, we're both. So I should be nice to both, but I've been too rigorously honest for years.
You're being tamed.
Same page that social unionism is a progressive force. It sure wasn't that many years ago. I was a new firefighter in San Jose, and our union was pretty reactionary in stopping hiring of women and minorities. And I don't know how prevalent reactionary unions are these days. So I'm delighted to hear it's a force for good that we're all talking about. That's a great. I'm happy about that. I was thinking the California Nurse Association. I don't know internally. I don't know what happens. Just as a person on the outside looking at what they're able to do, they can talk about environmental issues. They can talk about universal health care. I don't know how they got to that place. I think that is incredible that they can address. I'm wondering how far ahead they are. That's always a problem. I think of leadership getting too far ahead. Maybe that's not the case, say with CNA or not, but to me they're kind of a great role model in some ways. Maybe I'm totally wrong.
No, it helped that there was a huge nursing shortage, and that nurses in most institutions like UC who are on strike can actually make more money the day they're striking by working in an emergency room for the day. And therefore they have a very credible strike threat, which very few unions have these days, and it makes them very powerful. Now, it's not to put down the other positive aspects of what they do, but we're in a situation where we have way too many people with PhDs, and therefore we have a glutted labor market that we're trying to represent. That's very different than the situation for the nurses that CNA represents.
I mean, just quickly on the CNA, I would recommend the same dose of salt that Tom was offering us vis-a-vis his own union. The outside of many unions, or the way the union looks from the outside, is different than the way it functions on the inside. I mean, I'm a big fan of some of the things the CNA has done. Staffing ratios campaign years ago here in California, was definitely a model for everywhere else, though no other state has been able to duplicate their success. I think, sometimes when unions don't have a particularly democratic structure, the leadership is freer to launch a major campaign about the Robin Hood tax, which we all applaud, but, what does that actually have to do with the workplace problems of a lot of RNs who might like to see a little bit more emphasis on their day-to-day issues and problems? The CNA in my own community of Richmond doesn't represent people at the Chevron refinery. It represents people at the emergency room who have real patient load problems when the refinery blows up and 15,000 of my neighbors go running for the nearest emergency room. So those nurses at Kaiser Richmond Medical Center were very important allies when, over the last couple of years, there's been skirmishing at community meetings about what needs to be done to reduce pollution from the refinery and make it safer for workers and the community. When you have the building trades, showing up, doing Chevron's dirty work, saying everything is fine and dandy, why are you complaining about, the biggest business taxpayer in our community? It helps to have nurses saying, look, it's part of my job to treat the victims of this polluter's day-to-day activities, and both as a healthcare provider, political activist, and a union member, here's where we stand and what needs to be done. So they have played a very important role, but it is always easier to do that when your own members' employment, is not at risk of.
So are you saying are they?
It's easier to be an environmentalist when you're not in a fossil fuel industry.
Isn't it touch, or they're just they don't? I don't.
I think they have
are they too far ahead?
Political agenda, and it's sometimes connected to the workplace concerns of the members, and sometimes less so.
Well, they're in elected leadership, so aren't they?
No.
It's guided democracy, shall we say? I mean, guided democracy.
Yeah.
Did you have a response?
Well, let's take CNA and past this. two of California's great progressive labor leaders, Rosa Luxemburg, leader of Guided Democracy, quotes on democracy as well. Sal Rosselli, now leader of the National Union of Healthcare Workers, and great allies at the time, had a great dispute, so much of a dispute that we had two separate healthcare reform initiatives on the ballot in the state of California. In the absence of a left or a political party to hold them accountable, you had two individuals using member money to the detriment of the public interest rather than working together. I mean, it was a waste of even left liberal money. So, yeah, CNA looks good, but one person can effectively call a lot of the shots. It doesn't mean it doesn't look good on the outside. It doesn't mean the staffing ratio stuff, the stuff on public health, at least a progressive direction on fair taxation around the Robin Hood tax. It looks good, but there are problems still with building that ongoing culture and empowering those nurses to actually deliberate and carry a progressive culture for themselves. And when Roseanne's gone, we'll see what happens, because that's been a royal house with her in charge.
And there's issues of solidarity. I mean, the nurses, 18,000 at Kaiser, just settled a contract. They are nominally, the CNA, still affiliated with the National Union of Healthcare Workers that has 4,000 people still trying to get a contract from the same employer, overcoming a big management push for concessions for the last 3.5, 4 years. So how is it that the larger union at Kaiser, the larger anti-partnership union, the larger, more progressive, more militant union, just settled and left its own affiliated members in the lurch? In my experience in the telephone industry, if we had ever broken ranks with the IBW in our joint telephone campaigns, it would have been a serious breach of solidarity, betrayal, and played right into the company's hands. And I think this CNA settlement, without holding out for a settlement covering those 4,000 or 5,000 mental health workers, and not even having a joint strike strategy. The nurses are striking 1 month over this Ebola thing that was blown totally out of proportion. The next month, there's a week-long strike, by mental health workers at Kaiser, and two unions that are on paper affiliated can't even get it together to develop a joint strike strategy. I mean, that is a problem with the organizational narcissism of the CNA side of the equation, in my view.
I've got two more questions, but maybe we could just wrap up with a couple more questions and then finish up the panel. We're nearly at the end. So what I'd like to leave this conversation with, does the movement aspect of social movement unionism stand for the same thing as politics? If not, what is the difference between movements and politics? And last question, what role should university unions play in directing the work of the university? Is this compatible with transforming the work of the university or with overcoming capitalism?
Small question.
Small question, just to wrap it up.
Yes.
But it centers in on the following reality, that in the United States of America, when you say the word politics, people think that's about an election every 2 or 4 years. It never goes beyond that. It comes among choosing among the two possibilities, or sometimes slightly larger number, 3 or 4 possibilities at the start of a primary, that you might like to have represent you and make decisions for you sometime in the future somewhere that matter. That work can be very important. It's not irrelevant who gets elected to public office. I'm not suggesting boycotting the electoral process because of that observation. But politics has to go back to a much broader definition of engaging people, not just in electoral work. And the electoral work itself would benefit from it going beyond that notion. For example, having been elected to office 6 times, I know that when you knock on somebody's door in the middle of an election campaign, you don't talk politics with them. You ask them, what's the one thing that bothers you the most? You got about 30 seconds before the door is going to get closed. Maybe once in a while someone talks longer. It's not a good place to go out and engage in an authentic conversation about what people's needs are, their worldview, what would move them or not move them. You want to basically get them to vote for you or to vote for your issue, whatever it is, and you're very narrowly, instrumentally focused on that question. politics has to be about, and as was suggested earlier, the work that goes on long before you get to the electoral season, goes on year in and year out. It has to do with giving people an opportunity for democratic practice in their daily lives on various kinds of issues. So I'm fine. I am a Democrat, big D Democrat, when it comes to like who to vote for. Typically, there's some exceptions, but where there's partisan races and you have to choose between Democrats and Republicans, vote for the Democrat. 99% of the time, and you should get your members to do that. And it's important. It has a difference for who's on the school boards and who's your employer is going to be and public policy. But the majority of your work cannot be focused on that electoral work, that definition, narrow definition of politics. It has to be about the engaging people in their daily lives, having nothing to do with elected representational government. And that's what we've lost in America generally, and the labor movement, of course, went right. The labor movement could take blame for part of that, but they're also just swept along by what was otherwise going on in our country, where the whole idea of a politics that's about daily life and about where you work and your neighborhood got swept away for the idea of picking a representative. So I'm not in favor of third parties in the current period. When you actually have a partisan election, don't throw your vote away. Vote for the person that can win and do better for you than the other person. But please do something in between the 2 years between elections, other than waiting for the next 2-year election to vote for somebody again. Just a much broader definition of politics. And social movements are about that broader definition of politics, not about just who's going to be elected to office.
I would say that this question about is the movement the same thing as politics? I think it's kind of a semantic question. Politics, comes from the Greek word polis, which means city. So in that sense, yes, we are all part of a city. We're all part of a community, and everything we do is political, and we're kind of vying for power and position and resources and all that. So in that sense, absolutely, it's political, and I think a lot of the stuff we do is also involved in electoral politics. So I guess that's all I would say about that, and I think that's important. But in terms of your question, I think about what relationship should university unions have with the administration? What role should university unions play in directing the work of the university? I absolutely think the workers in any workplace should have direction over their work, because they're the ones doing it and they know it intimately, and they're the ones learning every day and trying to meet the needs of the organization. I think it should be a partnership. So I think there is. I once upon a time I hated labor management meetings. I thought that was just a way to pacify the unions, and I think that it sometimes is. But I also think it's a way to take care of a lot of stuff and have a seat at the table, and we should take that opportunity when it's working for us. And then there's a time and a place for us to advocate for ourselves in more vocal ways. And so I think that. Also, this is a public sector union. This is a public sector university. So we are here for the good of the state of California, for our community. And so I think that the people who are working here, they're not trying to make a profit for shareholders. They're trying to. We all have the best interest of our state in mind, I think, at the end of the day. And so, absolutely, we should have a seat at the table and help direct the work of the university. It doesn't happen enough. I mean, just one more brief thing about that. Like, look at Japan, right? Like the whole labor model in Japan is sort of embracing this concept of workers should have control and be able to influence their work policies, and that serves the organization and the business really well. So I would think that the principle would hold true here too.
Well, having listened to and supported calls for breaking with the Democrats and engaging in more independent political action for more than 4 decades, I've concluded this is hard to summon into being out of thin air. What is promising lately is the trickle-up effect of decentralized efforts around the country by active retired union members, repeating the pattern of progressive movement building here in Santa Cruz 30 years ago. People running for office and winning, mainly at the municipal level, statewide in Vermont for the Vermont Progressive Party, but in city council races in Seattle, Richmond, New Haven, Connecticut, Lorain, Ohio, Jackson, Mississippi. Some pretty impressive examples in the last couple of years. What's that?
Sanger, California, population 2,000. Socialist mayor.
There we go. At the local level, nonpartisan races, a lot of opportunities for one-on-one contact with people and relationship building, less of the pitfall of getting boxed into third-party marginalization, people coming out of the labor movement with a broader progressive platform are running, getting elected, and then having to figure out, as Mike said earlier, well, what do I do now that I'm mayor or city council member? How do I relate to the constituencies, the social movements that put me in? How do I use my exalted office to help build them in return? And I think if we have more of that going on, we'll be doing more to get to the point where our resolutionary activity about independent political action really has more shape and impact at higher levels of government.
All right, well, Ed, did you have a further point?
Yeah, just, I think the whole idea of who's the public, and public service and public administration is part of the high ground that public sector unions and the left in this country have to take seriously. Often leftists are oppositional, they bow down at the culture of the general strike, they worship shit in history books, but they don't want to take on and grapple with how do you serve the public, which is stratified, divided by issues of gender, so-called race, etc. But how do you generally serve the public, and what should public mandate be versus the domination of the marketplace and corporate capitalism? Those are profound ideological questions and practical questions, because it's not just about taking office. I think it's about democratizing public administration and building a culture of democracy in daily life. Those are the tasks of the long march of the institutions outside the university as well.
I'll give you just the last thought from me about this. I just finished reading a book by Bob Samuels, president of our union, about higher education, which he argues higher education could be free and actually cost states less than they're spending now. I've been working in higher education for 40 years and the labor movement for 50 years. It never occurred to me till I read his book about a month ago now, 2 months ago, that the higher education in California is a voucher system. In fact, throughout the country. It never occurred to me. It's like I've been fighting vouchers at K-12. They're terrible. They're going to destroy the place. You give each parent some money and they go shop, and then the marketplace manipulates them and abuses them in all the ways we might expect it might do it. But what is student aid? Other than students get a scholarship and they can spend it where they want to go, and the schools themselves don't get the money directly. It comes through the student loans, and therefore you have this tuition system that's built up, which is completely crazy. And it's basically a voucher system at the higher educational level. So I only raise that because someone that's been as active as me and intellectually involved as well as practically involved, it's never occurred to me that we've accepted mainstream thinking, Republican mainstream, right-wing, pro-business thinking, to the point that it never even occurred to me that I was looking at a voucher system. That's my job all these years and everything else. But that's what it is. It's a voucher system. And we've lived with it and never thought we should raise a question about it. And I never thought about it until 2 months ago.
I think that's a great admission. I really do. I think that's the kind of creative thinking and really reflective admission that I think is, and some of the other things that I've heard here today also are really great. And I really think that we can do this, but we do need to really, I think, kind of be a little more humble and like Mike was talking, and Tom, and basically everybody here, I think, is saying a lot of it. Just to really think outside the box and to reach outside the box to hear what people's needs are and meet them. But thanks, Mike. Appreciate it.
Thanks for coming, guys.
Thank you.